Good morning, everyone. Also to our online viewers, thank you for coming to this side event. We'll start a little bit later with 5 to 10 minutes delay, so please be patient. In the meantime, use the opportunity to have a look at this beautiful pavilion. Thank you.
Dear colleagues, our event is delayed for like a couple of minutes while the minister will speak with Mary Robinson, and we'll start. Apologies. Dear colleagues, I ask you to take the seats. We are starting in a couple of seconds. Please, yeah. Yeah, dear colleagues, I would kindly ask the speaker from a high-level panel to take their seats. And we are starting the event measuring climate impact across this cycle of armed conflict. And I would kindly introduce our distinguished panelist, Victoria Kirieva, Deputy Minister of Environment, Protection and Natural Resources of Ukraine. I would also very honored to introduce Mary Robinson, the Chair of Elders, members of the high-level working group on the environment consequences of war. We are honored to have you here. And Leonard de Klerk. We love you, Leonard, too, for your job that you are doing on behalf of Ukraine and the whole climate and planet, lead author of the initiative of the GAG Accounting of War. And I would give a floor to Victoria with the opening remark. Please, Victoria.
Thank you very much. Вітаю всіх.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon.
Сьогодні 1001 день, як Україна бореться з агресором.
So now is 1001 day during which Ukraine is fighting against aggressor.
Вчора в цьому павільйоні відбувся захід, на якому за ініціативи нашого міністра Світлани Василівни Гринчук були долучені високопоставлені гості.
Yesterday we had an event here with the participation of Ukrainian Environment Minister Svetlana Grinchuk and high-level officials from other countries.
Країни висловили своє занепокоєння, країни висловили свою підтримку і віру в перемогу України.
Those countries showed their support to Ukraine and that they believe in Ukrainian victory.
Але сьогодні ми будемо говорити за те, що агресор повинен заплатити.
But today we will speak about that aggressor has to pay.
Він повинен заплатити, і Україна повинна мати ресурс для відновлення, для зеленого відновлення.
He has to pay so that Ukraine have resource for recovery, for green recovery.
На сьогодні внаслідок агресії більше 65 мільярдів євро вже нараховано збитків.
Today we have estimated losses at around 65 billion euros.
Ми втратили більше 3 мільйонів гектарів лісів, що становить близько 25 мільярдів євро.
We lost approximately 3 million hectares of forest, which is approximately 25 billion euros.
Ми бачили терористичні акти, які відбувалися в нашій країні. Підрив Каховської ГЕС.
We saw terrorists on our soil, for example, Kakhovka power plant, hydropower plant mining and blow.
Знищення наших природно-заповідних територій.
Our reserves, natural territories, destruction.
Їхні злочини доходили до абсурду.
Their crimes are like absurd.
Вони навіть вивозили коней Пржевальського з наших заповідних територій з Асканії Нова.
They even took our animals, Пржевальські horses from Askania Nova.
Але тут ми будемо говорити, вперше я хочу подякувати Ленарду за це.
But today we will first speak here, and I would like to thank Leonard for that.
Вперше Україна піднімає питання щодо викидів парникових газів і нарахування їх обліку.
So the first time Ukraine raised the questions of estimating emissions of carbon gases and estimated the price of these emissions.
На COP29 ми презентували один звіт, презентували звіт за викиди за перший рік війни, за другий рік війни.
At COP23 and during the previous COPs, we presented our first and second reports about these emissions.
Вже на сьогодні викиди становлять більше 180 мільйонів тонн.
As for today, we have approximately 180 millions of tons of CO2 emitted.
Як я казала, це викиди Данії за один рік.
As I told, this is our data for the year.
Тепер нас стає друге питання: як юридично зафіксувати ці викиди? Як притягнути агресора до відповідальності.
So now we have a second challenge: how to put aggressor to justice, how to make this juridical, how to make it by law.
Тому, думаю, буде цікава панель, і пропоную всім активно прийняти в ній в обговоренні.
So I believe we will have a very interesting panel now, and I invite everyone to take part in discussions.
А від себе хочу сказати, що ми знаходимося на кліматичній конференції.
And from me, I would like to add that we are on a climate conference now.
Всі країни беруть на себе зобов'язання щодо
All countries take their
всі країни беруть на себе зобов'язання щодо недопущення глобальному потеплінню.
all countries take the responsibility to stop global warming.
Але країна-агресор Росія віддаляє весь світ від своєї цілі.
But country aggressor Russia puts us even further from this goal.
Тому ми повинні боротися, фіксувати і чітко визначати критерії, відповідно до яких вона повинна відповідати. Дякую.
So we have to fight, we have to document all those crimes, and we have to make those clear criteria why Russia should put to justice and why Russia should pay.
Mary, could you please also perform your statement? And also, like, if you can, as a member of a high-level working group, we're speaking a lot about measuring, about justifying the aggression. But maybe you could also touch upon, like, how can we make aggressor pay? Like, what mechanism, what judicial it is possible? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And it is an honor to speak to you today on this immensely important topic at this critical moment for Ukraine and for the whole world. And I'd like to thank our hosts and Minister Grinchuk and also the Deputy Minister for the opportunity to contribute to the discussion. I've actually prepared something a little bit at length because I've had quite a lot of experience now, and I want to share this. I'm speaking as a member of the elders rather than as chair. The chair passed recently to Juan Manuel Santos, who's the former president of Colombia, and also got the Peace Prize, the Nobel Peace Prize for his work on bringing peace with the FARC. And actually, Juan Manuel Santos visited Ukraine in August 2022, together with Ban Ki-moon as elders, to meet President Zelensky and also to see the victims of the Russian atrocities at the time in Bucha and Irpin. And in these times of profound global uncertainty, I know that Juan Manuel will lead the elders with his unerring sense of duty, diplomacy, and dedication. And obviously, I will continue as an active elder, very active elder. And he and I and all the members of the elders stand in solidarity with the Ukrainian people. We share your commitment to a just and lasting peace and to holding accountable those who have committed the crime of aggression. I'd like to start by revisiting a call that Juan Manuel made when he addressed the UN Security Council last year on the need for humanity to, as he said, make peace with nature. He challenged those on the council who wish to treat climate and conflict as separate issues, noting that in the real world, the consequences of climate change and conflict very clearly converge. He put it simply but clearly, and I quote, "There cannot be peace without sustainable development, and there cannot be sustainable development without peace." With that in mind, I commend the efforts that Ukraine has made against the background of Russia's horrific war of aggression to draw attention to the devastating impact the conflict has had on the environment. The past 2 years, as you mentioned, I've served alongside an esteemed group of international experts led by the former Swedish Foreign Minister Margot Wallström, and also including Greta Thunberg, on a high-level working group on the environmental consequences of the war in Ukraine. This group was established by President Zelensky to document the crimes against the environment that are part of Russia's war of aggression, but also to plan for a green recovery. I have to say, it has been a sobering journey, including 2 separate visits by train to Kyiv last year. We learned of the impact of the conflict on Ukraine's environment, ranging from the contamination of 1/3 of its territory with landmines and unexploded ordnance, to the pollution of soils, waterways, and forests from the impacts of shelling, fires, and floods, as the Deputy Minister has been mentioning. The most egregious example was the destruction of the Kafka Dam in June 2023, presumed to be an intentional act by occupying Russian forces, which flooded villages and farmlands across a huge area. But the impacts go well beyond Ukraine, as the work of EcoAction has shown. It's staggering to note, as you reported at the 2-year mark of the conflict, that the emissions from 24 months of conflict at 175 million tons of CO2s exceed the annual emissions of a highly industrialized country like the Netherlands. Assessing and documenting the impacts on the environment is the first pillar of the work of the high-level working group. And I commend the detailed work that has been undertaken to document these aspects of the conflict. I must also note that the impacts we see in conflicts elsewhere in the world, in particular in Israel's assault on Gaza, following the horrific Hamas terrorist attacks of the 7th of October 2023, and now the extension of the conflict into Lebanon. The death toll of over 43,000 Palestinians is appalling enough, but we've also seen the complete degradation of the soil, water, land, agriculture, and built environment of the Gaza Strip, home to over 2 million people. The damage wrought to Gaza's environment will be felt for years and decades hence, and outrageously, we now see this being extended to Lebanon. We also need to acknowledge, however, that conflict and climate is not a one-way relationship. We're also gaining an increasing understanding of the complex but very real structural effect that climate and nature crisis is having on conflict globally. Changes in climate that affect livelihoods and living conditions, from rising sea waters to desertification and destruction of arable land, lead inevitably to changes and tensions that can directly increase the risk of violence and conflict. While the world adapts to the new realities brought about by green energy transitions are drawn from the most insecure environments on the planet. Cobalt and coltan, essential for the rechargeable batteries in many of the devices we all carry, and increasingly those we drive, are sourced in the east of the Democratic Republic of Congo, where rival groups, some supported by Rwanda, vie for control of valuable mining sites in a bloody conflict. One of my fellow elders, the most recent member to join the group, is Denis Mukwege, a doctor from Eastern DRC, who won the Nobel Peace Prize for his work with victims of conflict-related sexual violence. Observing the spike in violence linked to control of cobalt mines, he said recently, and I quote, "In the DRC, the illegal exploitation of minerals for green energy, in fact, spells blood." Words like that should make us all pause here at COP29. We should ask ourselves whether we're doing enough to understand the linkages between not just climate change and conflict, but also climate adaptation and conflict. On top of all this, patriarchal oppression and gender inequalities mean that women and girls are most disproportionately exposed to both the impacts of climate change and the worst effects of the conflict. We see this with the continued prevalence of conflict-related sexual violence, including the horrific assaults on Ukrainian women and girls over the past 3 years of war, and in many other countries across the world, in particular in Sudan at the current time. And in fact, Dr. Mukwege's foundation has been working in Ukraine since the full-scale invasion of 2022, and I met some members there when we were on our second visit to Kyiv, to provide comprehensive support to victims of sexual violence. And earlier this year, his Pansy Hospital in the DRC hosted a delegation from Ukraine to learn more about his holistic approach to treating victims of conflict-related sexual violence, underscoring how interconnected global conflicts and human experience can be. And all of this underscores that it is an imperative of both climate justice and conflict resolution that people are held responsible for their actions and inactions. I've been particularly impressed by Ukraine's efforts, led by the Office of the Prosecutor General, to take steps to hold Russia to account for the damage it has wrought. The pursuit of accountability has been the second pillar of the work of the high-level working group. The final pillar of work that the group has been driving is the realization of a green reconstruction and environmental recovery. I've been impressed to see the action plan coordinated by the Ministry of Environment, and we discussed this together with the Minister just before coming in here, that is carrying forward work to address the recommendations of the group that were captured in our report issued earlier this year. Such a recovery will require a massive national and international effort, but I'd like to discuss one critical element. As I noted, women are disproportionately affected by both the climate and nature crisis and conflict, but they're also the source of essential leadership to respond to both. Looking globally, women's leadership can be much better leveraged to address the climate and nature crisis in fragile and conflict-affected settings. For example, funding support to women's organizations in these settings, which is far behind the UN Secretary General's target of 1% of official development assistance, could greatly expand women's agency in addressing these interlinked crises. In the Ukraine context, I would encourage particular attention to ensuring that the great capacity that lies within women's leadership is fully availed of and central. The working group produced an environmental compact for Ukraine that collected 50 recommendations framed under these three pillars of monitoring the damage, ensuring accountability, and mobilizing a green recovery. The document was endorsed by President Zelensky, and a national effort has been launched, I'm very pleased to see, to implement it, coordinate it under an action plan. Ukraine will need support to realize this innovative and ambitious plan. So I call on the international community present here at COP29 to step forward and offer its support, whether that is through technical advice or financial resources. We have an opportunity to establish a new norm of how environment is prioritized during conflict, to ensure that nature is no longer a silent victim of war. Looking back over recent years, I welcome that the debates under the UNFCCC have tackled the intersection between climate and conflict under the Climate Responses for Sustainable Peace initiative at COP27 and the Declaration on Climate Relief, Recovery and Peace at COP28. This year and at all future COPs, I hope this close connection can be maintained, and we cannot solve these problems in isolation from each other. Today's topic, emissions from military activities, represents a clear gap. They were not fully covered by the 1997 Kyoto Protocol or the 2015 Paris Agreement, which states having reservations on the ground of national security concerns. So the innovative work being presented here today is a welcome addition to increasing our understanding and establishing mechanisms to tackle this element of the climate crisis. And let me close by again expressing my admiration and appreciation of the efforts being made by Ukraine, its leadership, civil society, young people, and academic community to document the environmental damage of this illegal war of aggression, and in doing so in the face of such adversity and continuing conflict. The world can learn a lot from Ukraine's leadership, including its efforts to document environmental damage and the scale of carbon emissions that are attributable to the war, its national efforts to seek accountability, and its commitment to its green recovery. But it does need our support and need our encouragement, and the elders will continue to support and to encourage you. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your speech. Like as you rightly mentioned, like we have a really big conflict in Ukraine. We know who is the victim, who is the aggressor. We know and we're trying to calculate all the consequences of the war. But nevertheless, there are, as we find out by previous discussion, more than 100 conflicts all over the world, with their development, with their strategy, and a lot of climate emissions. If you calculate all the climate emissions from the war, it will take the fourth place after the others biggest polluters country. So definitely this needs to be stopped, and the aggressors should pay. I would kindly pass the floor to Leonard, knowing that Mary need to leave to another meeting. Thank you very much for being with us. Leonard, the floor is yours.
Yes, and in that case, I would like to invite my two other panelists. And thank you once more to Ms. Robinson for her contribution, because she clearly showed, the issues that we're discussing is not only Ukraine, but are happening worldwide. And when the full-scale invasion happened, you know, I think we were all in shock. I mean, not of course, Ukraine itself and Ukrainians, but also people that feel connected to Ukraine, like myself. You know, we try to, and we saw already that Ukraine very quickly started to register the damages that being done to buildings, to hospitals, already anticipating that at some point Russia will be held accountable for its atrocities. And very unique to that, it was that Ukraine also started to register environmental damages, which, if you look at previous conflicts, basically has never been done before, or at least not at such a systematic way. And in that sense, here also the civil society and NGOs played a crucial role. And I'd like to say, because sometimes, you know, from the outset, you happen to see that Ukraine, as a former Soviet state, it's similar to Russia. If you haven't traveled to the regions, then you might say so. But one of the crucial differences is between Ukraine and Russia is that Ukraine is a bottom-up country where you have a very strong civil society, and if the people don't like the government, they will simply change it because the government is there to serve the people. And one fantastic example of this participation is an app that the Ministry of Environment launched for citizens. If they see an environmental damage as a consequence of the war, they can make photographs and use the app to submit it to the Ukrainian ministry. Well, can you imagine that in Russia, that the state would ask its citizens to report environmental crimes? No way. So this is really, you know, what we're talking about. We're talking about a country that is truly free and is also fighting for its freedom. But I would like to move now to my presentation. So if you can show me the next slide, please. Next slide. Yeah. Next slide. Yeah, so very briefly, it has already been discussed before. 24 months of war causes 175 million tons of CO2 of additional emissions that can be attributed to the war. If you compare that to a country, it's like the annual emissions of a country like the Netherlands, or to get a better feel, maybe it would mean like putting 90 million fossil fuel cars on the road, and that's their annual emissions. Or installing 260 coal-fired power plant units. So what we're talking about is not small numbers. Actually, it is quite significant. Next slide, please. And here you just see a breakdown of the different elements of the war emissions. So it's not only the warfare itself, which you see at the top, but it also includes wildfires in forests and in other landscapes. It includes the movement of refugees, the destruction of energy infrastructure, and in our latest update, we also included the emissions from SF6, which is used to insulate high voltage switching gear. But last but not least, it is the reconstruction of the country. So those emissions will happen in the future. And basically, we're talking about an awful lot of cement and steel to rebuild the country, which means, you know, we all know that cement and steel is a very carbon-intensive construction material. Next slide, please. And it was already mentioned before, around the world, we have more than 110 armed conflicts ongoing. So when we started working on this on Ukraine, we also realized, and also in discussion with the Ukrainian ministry, we want to make what we are learning here in Ukraine today, we want to make that also available to other conflict impacted states. Of course, the war in Gaza is the other conflict that is most in focus in the news. But actually, as you can see here on the map, almost every continent in the world is impacted by an armed conflict. Yes, they are maybe not as high intensive as the two big conflicts at the moment. They might have been ongoing for a long time. They might be low intensity, but still, you know, these are armed conflicts, and we have currently no clue what the impact is on the climate. So next slide, please. So what we've been doing after in the past period is developing a tool for other conflict impacted states so that they can start calculating their conflict emissions as well. And basically we try to understand, you know, the impact of conflicts on climate. So you can see here, you know, several reasons why we're doing it. First of all is to get the numbers right, so to estimate greenhouse gas emissions of conflicts. Also see about, you know, how can we improve the accounting system, because sometimes, you know, these conflict emissions might not appear in the current system, and Igor will be talking about it. Another topic is dealing with emissions from disputed or occupied territories, like currently is in Ukraine, which Russia is also has now included in its inventory. And of course, on the long term, you know, conflicts hampers countries to effectively implement a climate policy, and it has an impact on its NDCs as well. But last not least, it's also about accountability. How can we hold the aggressor accountable? And Vasilina will be speaking about that topic later. Next slide, please. So the guidance has several elements that, in order to improve the quality of the numbers, here you can see, you know, the transparency, the efficiency, and consistency. Next slide, please. But we basically, first of all, try to learn from other guidance. So we've used the IPCC guidance. We've used also elements from the greenhouse gas protocol, but also from project-related guidance. Because how strange it might sound, but this is in fact, you can treat it as a conflict as a project with a start date, with an end date. The only difference is it does not reduce emissions below the baseline, but it increases emissions above the baseline. And then we took, we learned the lessons, what have been done already so far, which is fairly limited. We have the Ukraine study, which is already there. In the 90s, when Iraq withdrew from Kuwait, it put a lot of oil wells on fire. There is an estimation on how many emissions that has caused. We also have, by a US professor, she tried to estimate the fuel consumption of the US military in the war on terror in Iraq and Afghanistan. And very recently, we've seen a first attempt also to look at greenhouse gas emissions from the war in Gaza. Next slide, please. And these are the main elements of the guidance. So it's the time frame. It's important that you clearly define what's the start date of an end date of a conflict, and that's not always that easy, because sometimes conflicts can be simmering for a very long time and then explode. We've put in several examples of different conflicts, like in Korea, but also Ukraine is a good example. What is the starting date of the conflict? Is it the full-scale invasion, or did it actually already happen when Russia occupied and annexed Crimea? Geographical boundary is also important, because there are many transboundary impacts of war. It's not only the conflict state, but you clearly have to define where do you put the border of the conflict. And we see in Gaza, for example, which started in Gaza only, has now expanded to the southern Lebanon. We've seen Houthis in Yemen attacking. So you clearly need to find what do you take into account and what not. And then data collection is very crucial because we're talking about a conflict and the so-called fog of war. So it will be very often difficult to get data because systems have been broken down, and Igor might talk about that a little bit more. But you have to be, very careful that you also don't fall in the trap of the disinformation, because any armed conflict is also a war of words in which both sides try to, provide information that is not necessarily representing the truth, to say it mildly. Next slide, please. And then what we are calling impact categories. So these are the different sectors that you can look in. You saw already in Ukraine, the picture, a breakdown of the different impact categories. So we've developed the guidance for different type of impacts of a war. It's definitely not complete. I mean, what we're presenting now is a first version. We already are, thinking about including new activities, for example, demining activities after war has ended. And actually, people already approach us that apparently have those information. So we, are, as we're talking, as we're developing and learning from each other, how we can improve our estimations. Next slide, please. So here you see a QR code where you can download the guidance that we've releasing here at COP29. And actually, it also, if you're interested, you can also, through this link, reach out to the four reports that we presented on the climate damage of Russia's war in Ukraine. Okay, so that's what I would have to add, and I now give the floor to Igor.
Thank you, Leonard. Hello, colleagues. I'm glad to see you all here on the side event of presentation of our work, actually, of collective efforts to make a guidance on how to estimate greenhouse gas emissions from war-related activities, so to say. Since I'm a team lead of a greenhouse gas inventory team in Ukraine, so I will be a bit more technical in terms of what does it mean and what are difficulties in this sense in Ukraine. So I would like to start to mentioning on what is current state of guidances under UNFCCC reporting system exists, and where is a place for emissions which could be caused by Russian, caused by warfare, and which are not addressed. So basically, current UNFCCC system relies heavily on completeness principle, which says about geographical borders of countries, since it's country reporting system. So in the current guidelines, there are like categories and subcategories which could cover some portion of emissions. Well, basically, for example, use of fuel by military could be reported in energy sector, and landscape fires could also be reported under land use and forestry sector. But then again, all those categories should be covering entire territory of country, but then the conflict itself causes this sort of gray area when like some country may claim these territories to be their own, but the actually attribution of these emissions shouldn't be counted by them, or opposite, when the factual emissions caused by some country which is not actually responsible for this territory. So this is sort of gray area of current reporting of war-related emissions under UNFCCC, and there is no like guidance existing in the current guidelines under UNFCCC. Yeah, and also some emissions which are even in the current state of guidelines are not covered or not taken responsibility of by anyone, because for example, international aviation or maritime transport is basically cross-border emissions, which are kind of reported by countries to some extent as a bunker fuels, because it's a very difficult issue. And as you may know, negotiations on this agenda item lasts for, I don't know, maybe probably even more than 10 years, and there is no progress in that sense. So there are clearly gaps in current UNFCCC reporting system and current UNFCCC reporting guidelines to on GHG emissions. The second point I would like to also raise about data gathering, and this is something that we started to feel already after the start of full-scale invasion, even though it was the beginning of year and we were on the finish line of preparing Ukraine's greenhouse gas inventory since 1990 to 2021. And there are like a couple of reasons on what difficulties are right now. So basically, one reason is disruption of typical data flows, since a lot of territories has been damaged, destroyed. Some administrative buildings were destroyed. People were moving to safer places. So in the typical data flow from some sort of enterprise to regional office, regional statistic office, and from regional statistic office to central office, or something like that. There were like many places where this data flow could be disrupted, and we will not have a full data from on the central level, so to say. Also, there is a principle of voluntary reporting during the martial law. So basically, because we had like the government realized that it could be very difficult to stick to peaceful time rules and laws, they have released a little bit this strictness of reporting. That's why we have sometimes we have not full information reported because of this provision. And of course, there is a objective reason of some enterprises, some parts of facilities has been destroyed, and some central offices could be also moved or destroyed. So basically, some data providers cannot provide data objectively. And I have to remind you that in like the most so to say severe time of occupation, it was 20% of Ukraine's territory. So these data gaps could be much more significant than it could seem like. And also, since we are heavily relying on data collection, bottom-up approach, and on questionnaires from statistics and other governmental bodies, we heavily rely on this sort of traditional data flow, so to say. And we have quite limited use of remote sensing data at this point. And I want to show you the example of that. Could you please put the next slide? Yeah, so basically this example is taken from the current draft of Ukraine's greenhouse gas inventory. And as you can see, we have 3 lines of data from currently used in GHG inventory on areas of forest fires in 2022. So in Ukraine's inventory, the data from a state forestry agency is used. So this is officially collected data and reported by the responsible governmental agency. And then we have 2 studies that were using remote sensing data on fires, and then try to combine with land use maps or try to differentiate where forests are. And they have received, as you can see, more than triple the areas of forest fires, which could be, which we, of course, understand it's much more objective because it was collected independently and with no these risks of data flows gaps or gaps in general. But another column is basically estimations of resultant greenhouse gases, and this is the result of differences in how to apply different methodologies of what are the sources of data for actual emission factors, and the results could be very different. And the end column is something that is frequently used as comparison, which is actual emissions per hectare, and that could also be very different. So I wanted to showcase this example because it's very important to emphasize that the current state of data or the data at some point of time might be very different compared to which sources are you taking and what procedures are you following and what methodology you are using. And a little bit, and the last point I wanted to mention is about emissions from occupied territories. And since, as I mentioned on the beginning of my intervention, that UNFCCC relies on completeness principle, which includes entire territory of the country, geographical border, so to say. And Ukraine, since 2014, was calculating emissions for entire territory of Ukraine, including Crimea, including occupied Donetsk and Luhansk regions, using statistical data, using some approximations. And this task is going to be even harder with larger areas of occupation. And the big issue right now is that Russia, as you may checked or already know, or maybe you don't know, they have submitted their first biennial transparency report on the 10th of November, as I recall, and they include Crimea as a territory of Russia, and then they are claiming also Zaporizhia, Kherson region, and also Donetsk and Luhansk region. And there are no procedures currently or no guidance on how to deal with this double counting of territories. And one of the tasks of our delegation is trying to raise this issue of double counting and try to convince parties that it's first of all, of course, it's political, but second of all, it's a technical issue of not to double count the GHG emissions and to have actual and accurate data to inform parties in the process of global strategy. This is my quick, more technical, but some political issues. But then now I would like to give the floor to Vasilina.
Thank you very much. I probably will stand to see the slides. Great, thank you. So my name is Vasilina Balyo. I'm head of climate department at Ukrainian NGO EcoAction. And I think soon it would be already 3 years since we started our cooperation with Leonard and Ukrainian and international experts to account GHG emissions occurring from the war. As Leonard mentioned, our estimations show that for 2 years of full-scale invasion, the additional GHG emissions account to around 175 million tons of CO2 equivalent. But we all understand that we are reaching the 3rd year of war, so the numbers would be totally higher. But at some point, we understood that it's good to have data, it's good to have reports, especially unique reports, which first time in the history calculates such thoroughly the GHG emissions. But the real challenge is how to put those numbers into action. So we estimated that 175 million tons of CO2 would equal in around $32 billion of damages. So the next step is how to make Russia accountable for those damages. Next slide, please. Next, yes. Given the novelty of this legal question, we are facing multiple challenges, and here you can see part of them. So there is no precedent of interstate litigation in public international law to hold a state accountable. So basically, we do not have a silver bullet as of now to make Russia pay for climate damages. Even for environmental damages, liability rules are still evolving, let alone climate damage. One of the issues would be to establish causation and explain how certain state actions can be contributed to one or another action. Another challenge, no globally agreed methodology to calculate such damages. That's what we are trying to do right now, to come up with new guidance. Still a lot of work ahead, but again, no silver bullet in calculation of climate damages as of now as well. No explicit international obligation under which a state could be held responsible, and the details we will discuss a little bit later. And one of the most important questions, to whom the compensation should be distributed, considering that climate change affects all the countries, not only Ukraine. Next slide, please. So one of the most explicit answers, avenues to look for is international compensation mechanisms. And I must say here, just taking one step back, that in our efforts to find best ways to make Russia accountable, we started our cooperation with the legal experts. So the avenues which we will be discussing today, this is not what we came up individually. This is with the support of legal experts. So coming back to international compensation mechanism, what do we have as of now? So in 2022, United Nations General Assembly adopted a resolution calling for Russia to pay. We do not have international compensation mechanisms established as of now. So what we have is a registry of damage. But the important thing here is that registry alone is not the court, is not the tribunal. The registry would not evaluate the damages or order the payment. That must be done by the international compensation mechanism, and the registry is just one of the initial steps. Next slide, please. So if we again talking about registry, there is a section which allows the state of Ukraine to claim environmental damage. But as you see here, there is no explicit mentioning of the climate damage. So we assume that the climate damage would be incorporated in the environmental damage segment. Next slide, please. Now about other avenues for potential accountability, we need to pay attention to the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, and especially as it imposes a general duty upon states to protect the marine environment. But we all see here the limitation to the marine environment effect. So the interesting development with the International Tribunal on the Law of the Sea and the United Nations Convention is that back in December 2022, the Commission of Small Island States on Climate Change and International Law requested the tribunal, it lost, to issue advisory opinion on the marine environment and climate change. And in April 2022, it was found that anthropogenic GHG emissions into the atmosphere constitute pollution of the marine environment. It's actually a watershed advisory opinion, and it opens the certain possibilities in legal argumentation further on. But we all must understand here that this is just an advisory opinion, so it's not obligatory, and it does not assess any specific state's liability. But on the positive side, it will likely be cited in future climate change actions against both states and companies by other by the stakeholders, by the parties, and probably by the courts. As both Ukraine and Russia are parties to the United Convention on the Law of the Sea, that could be a plausible scenario for filing a climate damage against Russia. Next slide. Now, RUBIT, Russia-Ukraine Bilateral Investment Treaty. That could be an interesting area for the business representatives, actually. Russia-Ukraine Bilateral Investment Treaty, as you see, is still in force, but that's not for long. So in 2023, Ukraine terminated the bid with Russia, but as bids have a specific sunset provision, that would mean that for another 10 years, investors would be able to file claims against Russia. So generally, the bilateral investment treaty, it provides substantive protection, for example, to Ukrainian investors operating in Russia and vice versa. So why we are talking about operations of, for example, Ukrainian investors on Russian territory or Russian investors in Ukrainian territory, because we are in the full scale or what investments we are about. So the interesting development on that side is the arbitral tribunal's decisions. Basically, several of Ukrainian companies filed suits against Russia through bilateral investment treaty, and they were successfully decided for the Ukrainian side. So the tricky thing here is that if Russia occupies the territory and has effective control over that territory, that allows those investors whose investments were occupied to claim, to make a claim against Russia and potentially win. Yeah, so basically how in this business investment story falls the climate damage thing. Obviously, we are not talking about the standalone case, so the climate wouldn't win if he or she would file a claim against Russia, claiming that here I lost my investments, and because of that there is a climate damage. What we propose to inquire, especially for the business representatives, is to add a climate damage angle to their initial claim for harm suffered as a result of Russian environmental damage. So kind of tag along climate damage with their initial investment damage claim. Next slide, please. So as we see the dynamics in the legal sphere, I cannot omit mentioning ICJ and ECHR developments here. So if we are talking about ICJ, International Court of Justice, we all know that they are currently in the process of preparation of advisory opinion on the obligations of states in respect to climate change. Interestingly enough, that process, the grassroots, lies with the small island state Vanuatu, which actually initiated this process, and now we already have ICJ considering the advisory opinion. So the hearings are underway. Already in December, there would be public hearings. For Ukraine, probably the possibility to intervene is already closed, as submissions deadline already passed. But when the advisory opinion of ICJ on the obligations of states on climate change would be issued, then Ukraine must inquire whether it would be appropriate to file another claim for before the ICJ for an advisory opinion in respect to obligations of state who commit aggression in respect to climate change. And of course, ECHR case, the interesting development which happened this year when klimatsenjurinen successfully won the case against Switzerland. And yet again, one of the court decisions which stated that the states have the obligations before they are nationals concerning climate change. Next slide, please. So it's quite hard to make a conclusions, to generalize conclusions, but I'll try to do so. So none of the existing legal options offer a clear pathway to bringing countries like Russia accountable for climate change damage resulting from military aggression. So I will just reiterate, there is no silver bullet as of now to make Russia pay for climate damages. But as I was mentioning, the ITLAW's advisory opinion, ICJ, ECHR, we see that the law is evolving. So and we are evolving with the law as well. So basically, we do not have the answer as of now, but we are on our way to finding it. And probably for Ukraine, it would be hard to create a precedent. That would be quite challenging task, and several initial steps might result only in name and shame initiatives. So basically, we could file some claims, but they would not result in climate damage, and we must be aware of it. But this is what lies ahead of us, and probably Ukraine, being one of the countries who is guiding the initiative on the calculation, would be interested to be a leader in this process to shape and evolve international law to enable basically the aggressor pay for the climate damages. Thank you very much. The last slide. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Vasilina, for making actually this fairly clear presentation, because your topic is difficult to get across. We still have 10 minutes left, so I would like to open the floor to any questions. So if there are any questions from the audience, I see we have no lawyers here, but yes, go ahead.
How possible is it to expand this methodology to other conflicts? Is it a plug and play, or do you need a lot of local information to expand this to other conflicts?
Basically, for any calculation, you need local data. So that's always a given. But the methodology, how you convert that into CO2 emissions, that's fairly standard. So, for example, when we're talking about reconstruction, we have now default factors that says, for every square meter of damaged buildings, the reconstruction will, cost or will emit so many tons of CO2. So basically what we're trying to provide, and that's what we, in the carbon accounting for tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3 system. If you have limited data, you use default factors, tier 1. If you have very detailed data, you can also have a very detailed calculation method. For most of what we've presented so far in the different impact factor categories, we've limited ourselves to tier 1, so the most simple way of doing it. And as we are getting more experience with Ukraine, the war in Ukraine or other conflicts, we can further refine and detail it. You should keep in mind that also the IPCC has been working for, well, over 15 years, and each time fine-tuning. And basically, we've just kick-started that process.
Just add into the answer on that. The methodology itself should be kind of neutral in terms of what country or part of the world you're applying. So it provides you a general guidance on how to do the calculation. Then there are like guidances on what are the possible sources of data you could try to look into. We tried also to provide some examples of where you can find the information, or what are the differences in applying different emission factors, or what are the examples of trying to calculate these emission factors, which are provided in the boxes. So we tried to provide you some information that could help you understand what this guidance is, but the guidance itself is rather neutral.
Hello, my name is Marina, Rozvi Youth Climate Initiative in Ukraine. When talking about accountability and legal issues, we can say for sure that ecocide as a separate type of crime is not determined in Rome statute. So what is like the development of that? Like, what can we do as NGOs? Maybe it's more question to Vasilina. What we as Ukrainian NGOs can actually do to impact the pace, to speed up this decision-making process, because I know that some work is already being done in that direction. We push for this ecocide to be finally determined as a separate type of crime, but until it's not, Russia cannot be held accountable for the ecocide it has done. So what can we do, and what is being done right now?
Thank you for the question. I would say there is multiple levels to answer your question. Well, basically, if you're talking about ecocide and climate damage, we all must understand that the bar in ecocide on the evidence, on the persuasion is so high that we cannot combine with a high probability climate damage and ecocide in one topic. And if we're talking about the Rome Statute, yes, we all see the the international representatives as well as national representatives are pushing for the inclusion of ecocide in the ICC. But again, time limitations, the actions before the incorporation of ecocide in the ICC, that would be quite a challenge as well. And if we're talking about the ecocide in Ukrainian national law, we already have a definition there, but the challenges there would be to hold Russian individuals accountable who are outside of the territory of Ukraine. I think it would be quite hard to put climate damage into the ecocide concept. Probably we would not be able to do that. That would be related only to the environmental damage, and climate damage would go with a separate way.
Yeah, and if I may add on that, I mean, so we're not looking, because ICC is, criminal law. Emitting greenhouse gas emissions is not a crime. If it would have been a crime, we would all be here criminals in this room and in the world. So we're looking in a different direction. We've seen, of course, already some climate proceedings and awards that's related to humanitarian law, where basically countries like, for example, in the Netherlands, that was one of the first cases where the Dutch court instructed the Dutch government to do more about mitigation, to ensure, right of life for future generations. We are now talking about specific emissions which are connected to an act of aggression. And I think that combination, that's what we should be looking for. So then you are much more looking into sort of state responsibility. So if we get more, let's say, support from the ICG, for example, that the state is responsible for for its emissions and avoiding climate change. If you then connect it to an act of aggression, to a war crime, all of a sudden you have a much more stronger case that Russia is actually, doing the opposite what it's supposed to do.
Yeah, just an interesting question I wanted to add again to Leonard, that when we are talking about ecocide and ICC, we all must understand that we cannot hold state accountable under the ICC. So it relates only to the individuals. So what Leonard mentioned, we cannot make an individual be a criminal for emitting GHG emissions. So when we are talking about climate damage, we should rather explore state responsibility rather than individual responsibility.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you. That's the last question. I think we're perfectly in time while we started a bit later. So that brings us to the end of this session. I'd like to thank, our panelists, which include myself. So I thank myself too, and also, of course, for the previous speakers. We'll be here if any other questions. We're happy to answer them. Thank you very much for your attendance.